Hello, this is the voice of Stewart Pearce, and welcome to my series of deep dialogues. These are vital conversations I engage in with global soul stewards from all over the planet, providing us with vital understandings about how we can create a new hierarchy of values to help us evolve into a brave new world. I hope you enjoy, and thanks for listening.
Hello, greetings, beacons of light. Greetings, John. I am so pleased, everybody, that my dear brother, my soul brother, John Stewart Reid, is with us for the last of the male deep dialogues in this particular season. And you are the 13th dialoguer for this particular season, which in ancient numerology is the number of spiritual transformations. So I'm really, really glad. We've always had 12 people. So I do a season of 12 ladies and then 12 men and then 12 ladies and then 12 men. I tried mixing it up one season about 2 years ago, boy, girl, and it was really interesting. The harmonics did not actually function well. And so many people who were ardent listeners of this particular podcast platform said, could you please go back to just having men and then having ladies and then having men? So welcome, John. It's absolutely wonderful to see you. I would love to introduce you officially, if I may, with your bio to the wonderful people who are tuning in. So welcome, everybody. I mean, there's all sorts of names that I can see. Karen, Barbara, Stacy. By the way, Stacy, my name is Stewart, not D. I'm not a Stewart. Lauren, Karen, Deborah, welcome, welcome, welcome. We have sitting in front of us a very eminent gentleman. Green tea has just come through saying hello, everyone. John Stewart Reid is an acoustic physics scientist with a mission to educate, inspire, and excite the world through the field of visible sound, known to the world of science as Faraday Waves or Cymatics. John's work experience indicates that sound underpins the matter of the universe and has been recognized as a potent creative force for hundreds of years, and that sound carries the power to heal all sentient life, or indeed to reharmonize all sentience. John's work reveals groundbreaking information about mechanisms that underpin sound therapy and how sound is a natural healer, fully supported by his 5-decade career in acoustics, through which he is widely acknowledged as a global authority of Cymatic Science. John's CymaScope invention has changed our perception of sound forever. For seeing sound allows us to understand the power and depth of its omnipresent value within our world and how sound affects our consciousness, which of course is the essence of all things, consciousness thereof. So John, it's always so exciting to have you here, and we have this really interesting substance of this evening, biological noise transformed. And if I may, I'd just love to give everybody a subtitle, whether they're able to hear it or not. So it's recorded in our hour-long conversation, our deep dialogue. John's subtitle, ladies and gentlemen, for Biological Noise Transforms is Biological Noise is the random interaction of atomic particles within biological tissue, caused by millions of biochemical reactions. This occurs every second within every cell, and in a healthy body, the signal level greatly outweighs the noise. So in this deep dialogue, John will actually describe to us what this means. So maybe, John, we need to go into a definition, firstly, of what you consider the biological noise to be, and then juxtaposed what the signal level or the signal factor is. Is that okay?
Sure, yes. I'm really delighted to be with you this evening, Stuart. Again, it's really fun, and I'm sure that we're all going to learn a lot actually from each other here. First of all, it's important to understand that the body is indeed, or the internals of the body are really noisy. It's a noisy environment inside the body. And this is one of the great mysteries, actually, of biology, is how is it that the cells, our trillions of cells, are able to receive and understand signals from the central processor in this very noisy environment. And, one of the analogies that I like to give for this is a cocktail party, basically. You might have, 50 people all making quite a lot of noise. Maybe there's music playing in the background, so they're having to raise their voices even more against that musical background. And so you've got a jumble of frequencies going on there. And yet, certainly with our consciousness, Stuart, because we are conscious sentient beings, we can actually tune in that cocktail party to what someone else is saying across the other side of the room. If we're familiar with their voice, that is, we can tune in, can't we? And, kind of focus in on those sounds and literally kind of block out all of this other melee of sound that's around us. So that's a kind of analogy to, how the cells in our body are able to tune in to the signals from the brain, even though it's a very, very noisy environment. But to come back to your question, basically noise, what I'm referring to as noise here, is a jumble of frequencies that are not necessarily related to each other harmonically. Another, good example of noise is in nature. If you stand by a waterfall, it can be a very, very noisy place. And, there are thousands and thousands of frequencies of sound. They're all sinusoidal, is to say, they all follow the nice sine, the law of the sine, as it were, because these are natural sounds. However, they're not mathematically related to each other. They're not harmonically related to each other. They're all a jumble. Nevertheless, the sounds from waterfalls, actually, in terms of their frequencies, go way up into ultrasound regions. And I think it's pretty common knowledge now that ultrasound can be used as a therapeutic modality. So that's how I would define noise anyway, simply that it's a jumble of frequencies that are not harmonically related to each other. They can occur in nature, but equally, of course, there are many, many man-made sources of noise.
And thank you. And the origin of the sound, or rather the noise that we're speaking of, from a biological point of view, is there a definition that you have for the original exciter for the noise?
Well, the original exciter, if we're calling it that, is simply the molecular collisions that are in physics. They're called inelastic collisions. So if you think of, if we have two molecules and they're, because of the local temperature, they are literally jostling against each other, then it's actually the magnetic fields around those molecules that are bumping against each other, creating friction, right? But also creating sound. So in this moment when the two molecules collide, and of course there are trillions and trillions of molecules in your body that are colliding all of the time, right? In those moments, noise is being created. In other words, sonic frequencies. These are literally sounds. And then the other beautiful aspect to this, I think anyway, from a physics standpoint, is that these inelastic collisions between molecules are also creating infrared light. And both the sound and the infrared light don't stay put, they don't stay in their local area. They cascade throughout the whole of your organism. So in other words, there are noises everywhere inside your body, very, very noisy place. And even when I'd like to even just talk a little bit here about one's brain, because even in your brain, every time you have a thought, any thought, or you hold an intention, or you even might say a prayer, any of these ways that we are using our consciousness, every single one of them creates sound in the brain and light in the brain. Because again, if you think about it, the neurons in your brain are, they are the consequence of molecules. And again, you're having a thought, the molecules jostle against each other as a consequence of the patterns of the thought, and that creates sound. And again, it also creates infrared light. So those sounds and those lights, that light cascades throughout the organism, in addition to the electrical impulses, of course, which are also a consequence of these molecular collisions. And of course, it's the electrical signals, which are then cascading throughout the body in terms of signal that the cells are able to understand.
It's just such a thing of wonder, isn't it? And the fact that, as you're saying, that sound and infrared are correlated. Do you, I'm sure you do, do you have any wonderful insights into that keen relationship and the corresponding nature of it?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I love this subject. Actually, it's such a wonderful subject, I find, because, many people mistake this term frequency. When they talk about frequency, most people are not really aware of what they're referring to when it comes to the relationship between sound and light. Like, for example, you'll often see online, Stuart, where someone has taken a specific sound frequency and multiplied it by 40 times, 40 octaves, in other words, 40 doublings, to reach a light frequency, again, using the word frequency, right? Because, these are periodic phenomena. Sound is a periodic phenomena. Light is a periodic phenomena. However, they are two completely different aspects of nature. You cannot transpose a sound into light simply by, mathematical manipulation. They're different things, it's like apples and oranges are different things altogether. You can't do that. However, there is this, I think, almost kind of magical relationship between sound and light. So even now, as I'm speaking, there's a bubble of sonic energy emitting from my mouth and a little bit from my nasal cavities, creating a bubble which is expanding at the speed of sound. And as it expands, it's oscillating in and out with the same vibrations, that are happening in my larynx, in my vocal folds. So this bubble is expanding and oscillating as it expands. And of course, sound engineers and scientists they don't talk about the sound bubbles, they talk about sound waves. And in reality, of course, these waves don't actually exist, not as waves anyway. It's simply, that is a graphical representation of the bubble that's expanding and oscillating as it's expanding, right? So it is a kind of misnomer, it's a misnaming to call a sound bubble a sound wave. But nevertheless, we are kind of stuck with it. That's the term that is being used in physics today, in science. But the other aspect to this sound bubble, which is emerging from my mouth and my nasal cavities, is that at the same time that that's happening, a light bubble is also emerging. And of course, it's going to propagate at the speed of light, literally, 186,000 miles per second, give or take, right? And that the magic of this, for me, is that light that's being created, which, by the way, at all normal sound pressure levels that you can create from a normal voice, for example, or even a speaker system, that at those kind of sound pressure levels, we are always creating infrared light. It's never visible light until the sound pressure levels are ridiculously high. But at all kind of normal earthly sound pressure levels, infrared light is being created by every sound around us, certainly by my speech right now. And the light that's so created is modulated both in amplitude and frequency by those sounds. And I think this is really poetic, but it's also beautiful from a scientific viewpoint, because it means if we go outside, for example, and we sing to the stars, it means literally our song will be created in infrared light and will then zip through the atmosphere, because the air of the atmosphere doesn't unduly attenuate infrared light, which is why, of course, we can feel the warmth of the sun, isn't it? Anyway, so our infrared bubble will expand quickly through the atmosphere into space, where theory tells us it will travel forever unless it meets some dense matter. And of course, we know that the universe is largely empty space. So essentially, when we sing to the stars, Stuart, our song will one day reach the stars. Of course, tiny amount of energy, but nevertheless, it will still reach the stars. And of course, this is one of the wonderful aspects of the James Webb telescope that was, launched a couple of years ago and is now doing wonderful work in space, because it is optimized in the infrared spectrum. So the infrared aspect of this means that one day, perhaps, if we focus that telescope onto some distant planet that has an ocean and there are waves crashing on that ocean shore, right, that those waves will be creating infrared light modulated by the sounds of those waves. And the James Webb telescope, just in theory, could pick up that sound, not as sound, of course, as modulations of the light, which then is demodulated in the science lab, basically, to retrieve the original sound. And this process is already going on, not with exoplanets, but with it's a science called astroseismology, where astroseismologists will listen in to the sounds of our sun, for example, or the sounds of other stars, and simply demodulate that light, that twinkling light, to be able to retrieve the sound in the star. Anyway, it's an absolutely fascinating subject. We've gone off tangent a little bit here.
Have we? I feel that it's all interrelated. But but that's personally because I have this extraordinary relation, well, what I consider to be an extraordinary relationship with sound, which really came to me as a child because I saw sound. So I'm synesthetic. I have this crossover of the senses. So I would see sound and then hear sound and then feel sound. So, but downloading in very, very fast forms because of a certain degree of hypervigilance, because that was unusual. Apparently nobody else saw this or experienced this. And as you describe it, what I was aware of was sound as waves of light. But I now know that the frequency was joining with a sense of flow within the cosmos, that there were the circadian rhythms were magnetically flowing and creating these great waves of light and color. Depending on the level of intention that existed within the natural scope of the way that sound was being made, particularly within the field of the individual. So, for example, as a small child, I would see many of the female teachers or friends of my mother who were kind, compassionate, empathic, and gracious beings, that they had these extraordinary pastel lights around them. And these teachers over here that I evoked great displeasure from, a tremendous amount of disapprobation, they were angry with me. And so the colors became these terrible, dark purples and reds. And when they came towards me, they became like broken glass. In the meantime, what I was used to seeing on the waves of light were orbs or bubbles that were formed in tension. that, for example, when somebody went, ha, 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 I mean, that was a little bit ridiculous, but when they laughed very spontaneously, a huge bubble would be created, which will be a formation of the energy that they were feeling on a feeling basis, on an emotional basis. I mean, that's what I was seeing. So there's a sort of correlation with what you're describing. Why is the bubble or the orb? Because, then I went on in 1987 to hear these harmonic sounds that were rather like hearing the seraphic choir singing. And I opened my eyes and saw orbs of light. So when the angels come to me, they always come as orbs of light that are sound frequencies. John, why is the bubble or the orb significant?
Well, it's significant because it is a fact of nature that is not talked about. I mean, if you ask anyone what is the shape of sound, they will automatically say it's a wave. So it is a misnaming, and I've even had conversations with many scientists about this misnaming, and they don't seem to have any problem with it. I have a problem with it because lay people have been, in a sense, hoodwinked here, not deliberately, because the scientist knows that the wave is really spherical in a space form. They know that. It's not that I've made any discovery here in this sense. I haven't. I'm simply, I'm championing this model of sound in a spherical context. And one of the reasons that it's important, I feel, there's two primary reasons. One concerns the holographic aspects of sound, which are far easier to understand when we talk about sound bubbles than sound waves. And the other aspect to it is that when sound impinges upon us, say from a speaker source or a live musical instrument, for example, or we're at a concert, the way that the sound, when it enters our body, the way that the sound manifests on our cellular membranes is always in this spherical form. If you think about it, Stuart, every cell in your body that has a membrane, and that's almost all of the cells in your body, trillions and trillions of them, the cell membranes are roughly circular in most cases, certainly spherical-ish anyway, or spheroidal, let's call it. And basically what's happening is when sound enters your body from a bubble source, which is basically every sound that you've ever heard from your birth has arrived at your body as a bubble of energy. When it enters into your body, it manifests on every roughly spherical membrane of your body or cell membranes as a sphere, or essentially a spheroidal shape. And one of the really interesting aspects to this is that these beautiful patterns that are emerging, so that when I say beautiful patterns, I mean cymatic patterns or Faraday wave patterns, which are, for all of you watching, if you haven't seen any, well, please do look at our website, cymoscope.com, and you will find many, many of these beautiful cymatic patterns. And all music creates great beauty cymatically, and all vocal sounds create great beauty cymatically. So these are the sounds that are harmonically related, of course, to each other. And when they impinge upon a membrane, be it, a cellular membrane at the microscopic scale, or in a device like the CymaScope, which I think you can probably just see behind me here, where we have a small water membrane, again, that the sound is imprinted onto that water membrane. But whenever we create a cymatic pattern at any scale, as long as it's from a harmonic source, such as voice or music, it will be, subjectively beautiful. It will have symmetry. It will be subjectively beautiful. And one of the aspects to this that I find extremely interesting is that because music and voice we are constantly changing the phase of the frequencies within voice and within music, what happens from a cymatics point of view on the cell membrane, this cymatic pattern manifests, but it doesn't stay stationary, right? It rotates as the phases are changing within the vocal sounds or within the music, so the pattern is literally rotating about the cellular membrane. And the reason that that is important is because emerging from the surface of the membrane of every cell in our body that has a membrane are little integral membrane proteins. And this is the way that the cell communicates with its brother and sister cells around it. It's the way that the cell receives information from the central processor. It's also the way that the cell takes in nutrients and excretes waste products, okay? So these are little antennae for all the world. And when this cymatic pattern enters into the equation, you can now see what's going to happen. The antinodes, which are the areas of higher pressure in the cymatic pattern or the Faraday wave pattern, they massage gently the IMPs that are projecting like little antennae from the cellular membrane, okay? So this is one of the many biological mechanisms by which vocal sound and music create healing or catalyze healing in the body. And it's just, once you know that every source of sound that's harmonic is going to be creating this great beauty on your cellular membranes, well, I, for one, I can never immerse myself in music ever again without visualizing this beauty that's occurring in my body. And I think it's a wonderful, wonderful thing, Stuart.
I think it's so beautiful. I mean, I feel that a quote like the one that you've just uttered needs to become a signal device in every single classroom throughout the world, both in university, high school, and in primary education. And indeed, why not in each workplace, so that we become aware. And of course, we know people like Julian Treasure and other acousticians have really worked through these principles very thoroughly. Maybe not from the scientific perspective that you have. In a moment, I'd love you to define for any of our listeners exactly how the CymaScope functions, because maybe cymatics as a science is quite new for some of our listeners. So I'd love to define that. But just also to drink in some of the comments that are being left in the comment box. But we know that sound through cymatics takes on physical patterns, and so we begin to see the interrelationship between those organic patterns and the way that, for example, the great poet Goethe said that all architecture was frozen music. So we begin to see, one of the fond devices that I opened up when I was working at Shakespeare's Globe, or rather around during the building of Shakespeare's Globe, because all of the oak wood that is used in the theatre is 400 years old. So in other words, it was alive at the time of Shakespeare. They were young oak trees. So I went into the wood, some of the principal woods of this great nation, with the woodman who could read wood. And so he was able to, really define that this tree was around when Shakespeare's words were being emanated as bubbles from the actors' mouths or whomever was speaking them. So there was this extraordinary understanding that life was still within the spirit of the wood. And indeed, although the English oak is the body, the circle, again, this spherical form that we always imagined, the two trees on stage that hold the heavens and the earth together are Scots and Welsh. So it becomes a united kingdom of oak. I would like to think now that during the time that I was there, the 10 years that Mark Rylance was the artistic director, without going into any displeasures, I feel that the sound of the great words of Shakespeare are no longer as equitable as they were at that time. We were really producing something of great excellence during the 10 years of Mark's residency as artistic director. But those sounds are now also in the wood of the globe. However, I'd love you to talk a little bit about the CymaScope and how you came upon the invention of the CymaScope and the fascination that you have for cymatics in general.
I'd love to do that, Stuart. Thank you so much for inviting me to discuss this aspect of my work. before we reach that, just a comment that you made there about Goethe brings to mind Rosslyn Chapel. I'm sure many of your followers, your viewers will know about Rosslyn Chapel near Edinburgh in the UK. And it brings to mind, Goethe's quote there is brought to mind because, as I'm sure you know, in the Lady Chapel of Rosslyn Chapel, there are what they're called the Rosslyn cubes, or music cubes, that are hanging off the ceiling. These are really beautifully carved little crenellations, you could call them, that are decorating the ceiling. And they have on their surface what looks like a cymatic pattern. There are many different cymatic patterns, and many people for the last 50 years or so, had looked at these from a point of view of, oh, don't they look like Chladni patterns, where you take a brass plate, for example, and you sprinkle on some powder and you play it with a violin bow, play the edge with a violin bow, and lo and behold, a beautiful cymatic pattern appears on the surface of the plate in the sand or whatever particulate matter you sprinkled on the plate. And so these patterns on the Rosslyn cubes, many musicians, for example, had studied them thinking, is this frozen music? Is this a way? And indeed, my dear friends, Stewart and Thomas Mitchell, who are sadly no longer with us, they've passed on. But they did indeed, as a father and son team, decode those cubes, create a beautiful piece of music from the notes of those cubes called the Rosslyn Motet. It's a haunting, gorgeous piece of music. And then an interesting little coda to this story is that I was approached by, I think it was one of the ITV programs who were doing a show on the true Da Vinci Code. And of course, you'll remember that Rosslyn Chapel was the place where Dan Brown's marvelous novel partly took place. And anyway, so they were contacting me to see, did Stewart and Thomas get it right? Is this really correct, what the research that they had done? I was a bit nervous about it because I was very dear friends of theirs, and I didn't want to disprove them. Anyway, to cut a long story short, the film crew came here, and under the eyes of the cameras, we literally made visible in real time these notes, these musical notes, which Stewart and Thomas had identified. And I was able to confirm for the cameras, as they rolled, that they were indeed the correct notes, that they had been embedded in stone, frozen in stone for hundreds of years, and it's this beautiful melody, So anyway, that's that little story.
Amazing. And the fact that you were actually able to, as it were, recreate,
yes,
to indicate the geometric form through sound waves is just absolutely extraordinary. And so, for those of you who are interested, I hope you are all fascinated by the substance, because we're speaking on many levels about the wonder of sound, the magic of sound, the miracle of sound. But the place that John has just referred to is just outside Edinburgh in Scotland. So it is part of the United Kingdom, but it's also Scotland, which is, of course, governed by the unicorn energy, which is really interesting. Anyway, that would take me off onto too much of a tangent. The building was actually in the provenance of the Sinclair family, wasn't it? I think it goes back about 400 years, does it?
It does about 400 years. And one of the other experiments that I conducted in the crypt of Rosslyn Chapel, this is many years ago, this is going back to 2005. I took an early CymaScope instrument. I know we're going to be talking about the CymaScope in a moment. So just to mention, that the CymaScope instrument has gone through many iterations in its lifespan. And this very early instrument that I created using sand, again, on a membrane, in this case, the membrane was latex that I was using in 2005. And we took that into the crypt of Rosslyn Chapel. And the reason this has just come to mind is because you're talking about the Sinclair family, who, you know, their motif is a cross. It's called the Sinclair cross, right? And in the middle of this experiment in the crypt, and by the way, at the time that we went there, Stuart, there was the Dan Brown film set literally set up in the crypt, right, as we were working there with this early CymaScope. And anyway, cut a long story short, there was a Scottish lady there who had a kind of soprano, beautiful soprano voice, and she made this really high-pitched vocalization into a microphone, which was then fed into the CymaScope, and up on the screen came a whole field of Sinclair crosses, just one after one row and after the other. It was an amazing moment. You know, I still never ever forget that moment. I get goosebumps even thinking about it now. So anyway, that was an early iteration of the CymaScope instrument. But it all began, as I'm sure many of your followers and viewers will know, it began in the Great Pyramid, actually, in 1997. And actually this year, if we gain the permission from the Egyptian Antiquities Department, which we're actively seeking right now.
We're sending out a prayer for you, John. Everybody say a prayer. Just give us the time frame. You're going to be there, hopefully, in
October this year, early October.
Early October.
Yes, and
John's trying to gain permission from the Supreme Council of the Antiquities, ladies and gentlemen, so that he can go back into, yes, he's been before, and he's about to tell us the most extraordinary experiment that experiment? I suppose it's experiment.
Yes, it was definitely
that he had vis-a-vis cymatics in the King's Chamber of the Great Pyramid. So just before we go there, so we're talking about the Sinclair family Roslin Chapel, which has a mystical provenance, ladies and gentlemen, going all the way back into the Templars, and probably through the stimulation of Rosicrucianism, which of course is the esoteric doctrine within Christianity. John, I want to introduce you to a dear friend of mine, Alan Green, who was on just a few weeks ago, talking about all of the cryptogrammic significance of Shakespeare's words. You will be mind-boggled by Alan's information. I have to get the two of you together so that we can actually conspire in this wonderful symposium about the nature of the way that you are approaching sound and the way that Alan is approaching the cryptogrammic consciousness.
I would love that. I would really love that. And, you know, Alan might be very surprised to know that during the COVID pandemic, we were involved with a project to make poetry visible for the giant Times Square screens, you know, those massive screens that are the size of buildings. Well, CymaScope imagery was showing during the COVID pandemic in Times Square. And this was the first time that we'd actually worked with poetry. It was a line of poetry that a group of artists in New York City had together decided, you know, to actually get involved in this initiative, which was to help support the health workers in all of the hospitals and clinics in New York during the COVID pandemic. It was a lovely little piece of poetry. And not only did we make it visible in English with the CymaScope instrument, of course, but also in several other languages which they sent us. They sent us this little line of poetry in Russian, in Chinese, in Spanish, of course, but also in Creole. I thought that was a really interesting choice. But these were languages that apparently are, you know, spoken very frequently in New York City, in addition to English, obviously. Yeah. And so this was, you know, making poetry visible for the first time. So now let's talk about the CymaScope instrument and how all of that.
You have a recording of that, a video recording of that.
Yes. Oh, yeah. I've got it all on recorded. Absolutely. Yeah. And in all different languages. Yeah.
I would love to see that because, of course, as you know, I have this extraordinary close connection with poetry, and I have always been involved in the entertainment process of producing poetic words or dramatic verse. I mean, the drama school where I was head of voice for nearly 20 years was a classical conservatoire. That's how it all started. And then I went to Shakespeare's Globe. So I'd love to tune into that, because poetry is very much in my heart. And there's a whole theorization, well, experientialization, that I'd love to share with you about how our consciousness is developing away from a purely digital form, we hope, into a metaphoric state where feeling becomes the language of the soul. Anyway, so there's a whole substance there. And the cymatics of poetry, particularly the great poets, where there is rhyming scheme, where there is sprung rhythm, where there is the iambic beat, seems to bring about the greatest level of exposure to the meeting point of waves of energy. I'm just simply dealing with the experiences that I had at Shakespeare's Globe, where I would see the sound and I would see the harmonics. Which incidentally I remember doing about 25 years ago in Roslin, where I was given the opportunity to chant and to use harmonics, to use overtones. And again, somebody who is a great actor friend of mine, who is also a synesthete, started to sketch what he was seeing, and he just was sketching T's, which were rather like the Roslin cross, So
amazing.
But back to your wonderful invention of the CymaScope.
Yes, I'd love to tell that story. And oh, by the way, imagine maybe Shakespeare's sonnets made visible. They would be gorgeous. I mean, I can only imagine, how beautiful they would be, especially from, someone like yourself who has a beautiful, voice that can create such great beauty with the CymaScope instrument in real time. It would be a real pleasure, to see your voice made visible, reading a Shakespearean sonnet. How would that be? Eh?
Because you very kindly invited me to chant, which I will do, and I'm moving out of a period of immense activity as I move in towards the end of this month. So I will chant, and I will record Ash Wednesday by just a small section by T.S. Eliot, and I will record a sonnet so that you can play it through the CymaScope and see.
Oh,
so
wonderful.
The CymaScope is.
Yeah, so 1997, very short version of this story, because I'm sure some of your followers and viewers have already heard this story, but very short version is that I carried out a series of acoustics experiments, pretty standard acoustics experiments, in the Great Pyramid and in the Red Pyramid in 1996. But there was one particular experiment that I did not have time to conduct in 96, and that was a Cymatics experiment. So, and this one took place only in 1997 in the King's Chamber of the Great Pyramid. And the idea was that I had already mapped many of the resonances, the acoustic resonances of the sarcophagus, this 3.7-ton granite box in the King's Chamber. I'd already mapped those in 96 with conventional instrumentation. Now I was interested to see those resonances, to make those resonances visible. And so the experiment I conceived was very simple. Instead of me lying in the sarcophagus as I had done in 96, when I was first inspired to carry out all of these experiments, now instead of lying in the sarcophagus, I placed a small speaker there, and I stretched a membrane, in this case PVC actually, across the open top of the sarcophagus, having first repaired the broken corner, because one of the corners, the southeastern corner, is quite badly broken away. So I had to repair that temporarily, Stuart. But to cut a long story short, the experiment was hugely successful in two ways. The first way was that I had severely injured my lower back before going out to Egypt in 97. I'd lifted something at an angle, very silly. I really badly pulled a muscle in my lower back, and I was in excruciating pain. And I didn't think actually I'd be able to even carry out the experiments. I was in so much pain. but I took probably more analgesics than I should have done, and somehow just gritted my teeth and managed to get myself into the pyramid with all the equipment. Other people carried it all in. I didn't carry anything in other than my camera. Set up this experiment, stretched the membrane across the open top of the sarcophagus, made sound into the sarcophagus with this small speaker and an electronic oscillator, making very pure tones. And what then happened, by sprinkling sand on the surface of this PVC membrane, what I saw, and the antiquities inspector saw as well, who was with me, a whole series of ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs appeared in the sand that day. It was an astonishing moment in my life. Never forget it, obviously. But the other amazing thing that happened was that 20 minutes after making sound in the King's Chamber for this experiment, this Cymatics experiment, all of the pain in my lower back completely vanished. And in the moment when this happened, the thought process that went through my mind was, I know what's going on here. These are endorphins flowing in my bloodstream, basically natural opioids, that are created in anyone's brain when you are on an emotional high. When you have a peak experience of any kind, then opioids are, these are natural endogenous opioids created in your brain. And what they do, these opioids, they put you into a euphoric state, for one thing. And I was definitely in a euphoric state. You can imagine, the excitement of seeing ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs popping out there in front of my eyes, and the antiquities inspector's eyes. So yes, I was in a euphoric state. But the other thing that opioids do is that they mediate pain. They actually are preventing the pain signals reaching the brain to be interpreted as pain. Now, pain is a very important aspect of our physiology. It's really important because it's signaling one's brain that there's a problem in your body and you should take care. You protect wherever this pain is, protect that area until your body's natural healing processes can deal with it. So it's a really important thing. But of course, for some people, they have chronic pain in their body that doesn't go away when they take any analgesics. It's there all the time, and it's very, very debilitating. So out of this work that I'm describing now, these experiments, having been healed within 20 minutes of this extremely severe pain, I now, of course, have studied biological pain in great depth. And I now have a lot of knowledge to be able to share with the world as how pain can indeed be mediated by sound. But coming back to the Cymatics experiment, hugely successful. Pain vanished within 20 minutes, never came back, right? Because it wasn't just opioids. It wasn't just, what I thought it was. It wasn't these, endorphins. It was actually something much more important than that we don't have time to go into today, another time perhaps. But nevertheless, it was an amazing moment in my life that set me on this road to understanding how pain can be mediated without analgesics, without pharmacological substances. But then the other aspect to this really amazing series of experiments was, of course, it showed me that cymatics could be a new tool for science. And so when I eventually, got back to the UK after these experiments, I immediately set about to create an instrument that could make sound visible. And just as I mentioned earlier there, the initial iterations of the instrument were very like the sarcophagus, you could say, in the King's Chamber, a flat membrane, sprinkling on some kind of powder. So that early CymaScope in 2005 that we had in Roslyn Chapel, that was just like that. It was a membrane that you sprinkle on some sand and, make sound, and therefore you see whatever patterns emerge as a result of the sound. But Stuart, I very quickly came to realize that sand or other particulate matter on a membrane was not going to cut it. It was just two-dimensional. It was very, lacking in detail. And so I then came to realize that if fluid would be needed, in fact, one of my, scientific heroes and mentors, you could say, is Michael Faraday, who had himself experimented with what he called crispations. He didn't call it cymatics. That cymatics was a term, coined by Hans Jenny in the 1960s. But he called it crispations, and you can see him hanging on my Faraday cage wall over my shoulder here. Michael very often, just makes sure that I'm doing things right. Anyway, he's one of my great scientific heroes. And so he had used many different fluids himself, including egg white. And so I followed in Michael's footsteps, the work that he had conducted with crispation stroke cymatics. I did try egg white. I did try Scotch whiskey at one point, and had the advantage of, having a little tipple after you've done the experiment. But in truth, none of the liquids that I tried performed as well as pure water. Very, very pure water turned out to be the best, the optimal surface on which to make sound visible. So coming back to what the CymaScope instrument, how it actually works, is a very small volume of water. If we can liken it to a thimble, it's a little bit larger than a thimble, full of water. And the surface of the water, first of all, if you think of that a little bit like the surface of glass, and you know how if you put your fingerprint or your thumbprint down onto the surface of glass, you will see a pattern if you sprinkle on some fine talcum powder. It's a similar kind of process to that in a way, giving you that as an analogy. We are literally imprinting sound's vibrations onto the surface of this very pure water, and therefore creating a pattern. Now, the pattern, which is an analog or a model of the sound, is essentially invisible until you sprinkle on not powder, but light. So we irradiate, let's say, the surface of the water with special lighting, and that allows us to see the pattern immediately, makes that pattern visible. But the other important thing I'd like everyone to realize here is about cymatics, is that the pattern is not only on the surface of the water. In even a thimbleful of water, there are countless trillions of water molecules, obviously. And normally, water molecules are all randomly dispersed. They've got no order. There's absolutely no form to them whatsoever. But as soon as you introduce sound into water, immediately beautiful order takes place. So yes, we see this pattern on the surface of the water, but that pattern literally goes right through all the levels of the water, creating order all the way through the water. And this is why, and you'll see in many of the cymaglyphs, which is the word we use to describe sound image, or just to say sound image, we use the word cymaglyphs, a little bit like hieroglyphs, right? And very often, looking at a cymaglyph, you'll see this great depth. You see that it's actually three-dimensional. It's not just the surface that you're looking at. And again, thinking about your body, how when we are immersed in sound, even your own vocal sound is ordering all of the molecules in your body in a beautiful, harmonious way. And this brings us, Stewart, to the point where if we're going to continue the subject of biological noise, I think I need to say something about how vocal sound and music can basically can create order against the noise, can create a signal against the background noise in our bodies.
I would love you to do that.
Thank you. Well, because this is a subject that we were intending to talk about, this evening, isn't it? Well, the essence of it is this: that if you had asked me this question, how can we tip the scales. Let's say we've got a set of scales where we've got noise on one side and we've got signal on the other. How can we tip the scales towards signal and away from noise? If you had asked me that question before...
Well, I did actually, but we went off on another tangent.
I know. But what I was going to say was, if you'd asked me that question before...
The position I hold crucial within my consciousness for our conversation, but it's okay. It's okay. So,
if you'd asked me that question before 2005, I would have said, oh, well, there's a really easy answer to this question, which is that the vagus nerve of our body provides a really ideal pathway to bring sound into the signal, in other words, into the body. And the reason this is true, of course, is because when the vagus nerve leaves the brain stem, it first branches off to the two tragus of the ear. So this little flap of tissue, if you're not familiar with that term, everyone, the flap of tissue that overhangs your auditory canal is called the tragus, and that is where the vagus nerve first terminates. Actually, not only, if we're being strictly accurate here, not only to that tragus point, but also other points in the ear, which is why your ears are so extremely sensitive to the touch, right? And many people, think of them as erogenous zones even. And this is the reason. It's because the vagus nerve first terminates mainly at the tragus. Well, this is great news, isn't it? Because it's a kind of pathway, an easy pathway to bring sound into the body. And so immediately following where it branches off to the tragus, it then immediately goes to the pharynx and the larynx. So again, great news. It means that when we make our own vocal sounds, whether it be singing or speaking even, all helps to stimulate the vagus nerve and to create more signal in your body, tipping the scales away from the noise towards greater levels of signal. However, the reason I mentioned 2005 was because if you'd asked me the question after 2005, I would have said, well, in addition to the vagus nerve part of the answer, there's another even more wonderful part to the answer. And it comes from the Niels Bohr Institute in Denmark, who made the most astonishing discovery in 2005, which is this, in a word, in a nutshell, that the nervous system of the body, all of the nerves of your body, their primary role is to conduct sound, not electricity, right? Okay, they do conduct electricity, but get this, the electricity that's created in nerves is created as a byproduct of the sound. So now think about it. If you are immersed in a sound field, whether it be, music or even your own vocalizations that you're making, right? When you're singing yourself, these sounds that you make vocally, obviously some of those sounds are actually propagating directly through your body. Others are obviously propagating out into the room, creating a reverberation in the room, say, but then some of that sound is coming back to you, which is why you can hear it, obviously. But now think about it. If the nerves of the body, well, it's not saying if, the nerves of the body, their primary role is to conduct sound. So now if we think about this, guys, thousands and thousands of nociceptors. These are this is the word that describes the free end of nerves as they are just under the surface of your skin, right? In your fingertips, there are hundreds of nociceptors. Other parts of your skin, fewer numbers, but certainly all of your skin is covered in nociceptors. These are the free nerve endings. And of course, internally as well, right inside your body, all of your organs, excepting your brain, by the way, all have these nociceptors. This is how you can feel pain internally, if you have a problem with an organ or whatever, right? But surface-wise on your skin, hundreds, thousands everywhere on your skin. So now, if we get this picture of a human being standing in a sound field, whether it be music or singing, or you're making your own sounds, right? Now, all of these nociceptors are literally sucking in all of that vibrational beauty, right? And raising tipping the scales massively towards signal and away from the noise that's always present inside your body. So now we can get this picture of all your trillions of cells that are in joy because they're receiving all of this great harmonic beauty, both directly through the nerves, as I've just been describing, the pathways, but also remembering what I said earlier about the beautiful cymatic patterns that are rotating about your cellular membranes. So that's the answer in a nutshell, Stuart.
Well done, you got there. That's absolutely brilliant. Because you went in this beautiful arc and you came back to that singular promise of what we're talking about in terms of how signal, in many ways, overrides noise. But the glory of it all, Shakespeare said that the riot of nature is in sound. That we have been able to feel your passion, your immense intelligence, and how your spirit illuminates the conviction of the fact that sound affects matter as a transformative agency, and therefore brings us back to our own diligence of being able to really work on the harmonic patterns of our own being by finding sounds on the outside of us and on the inside of us that are pure harmony. John, we've run out of time. This has been absolutely amazing. And I want to thank you very keenly for coming forth and finalizing this season of Now You Are Number 13 speakers in the male season of Deep Dialogues. And I think you're probably somewhere in the region about the 140th speaker. So that's that's wonderful. Thank you so much. And also to you, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for tuning in, whether you're tuning in this moment or indeed listening to the recording. And we're now going to have a slight vacation because that's what happens during the month of August, as we know. But we will be back for the next Deep Dialogue on September the 11th, when I begin a season of ladies. And we will begin with the wonderful temptress being of Patricia Corey, who has written so many books about Atlantis. So John, again, thank you so much. And to everybody, namaste, namaste, namaste. Thank you. Bless you. Do stay where you are.